I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and this is an outrage. Okay, maybe that's a little dramatic, but Andrew Park over at the Headphone Show recently published a video where he makes the argument that IEMs are objectively worse than headphones. And while, yeah, he actually makes some pretty good points, this is ostensibly an IEM-focused channel, so I gotta rise to the defense of IEMs. And in fact, I do have a few beefs to pick with Andrew's video, so that's what we're going to talk about today. We are going to destroy Andrew Park with facts and logic, or maybe point out some things that he would actually agree with, but I know I've actually at least got one point that he's not going to agree with. We'll save that one for last. But before we start, I guess just talking about the subject. What does he even mean by IEMs are objectively worse than headphones? And I think I could probably summarize Andrew's opinion as two main points. I think he's making two arguments about how IEMs are objectively worse than headphones. Point number one is talking about the measurements of IEMs being less useful than headphone measurements, okay, which we'll talk about that. And then point number two is about IEMs being worse by design, or like because they make more assumptions, and we'll dive into that, but that's kind of going to be the outline of this video. And I figured, you know, we're heading into Can Jam, New York, we're all going to be in the same space, so what better time than to start a fight? But really, this is not a fight. This is just kind of a continuation of this discussion, and maybe just more consideration for, as you're looking at graphs, be a little bit more open-minded than you think you might need to be. But I digress. All right, so argument number one is that the measurements for IEMs are worse than the measurements for headphones, or in other words, they're less useful or less predictive. And I think Andrew makes some good points, but I don't entirely agree with his take. But let's break it down. I think he kind of goes into actually two different points within this argument. One of which being that, you know, just quibbling with the IEC 711 coupler that you see a lot of measurements for. With this, he makes a couple of issues, or points out a couple of things. So one, that the air pressure volume inside of an IEC 711 coupler is making incorrect assumptions, and that a 5128 coupler is actually more accurate. And I don't know, that might be true on average, but it does also kind of just get into the problems with measurement rigs in general, is that they make assumptions about human anatomy and population averages, and I'm not necessarily a population average, you might not be a population average. So possibly he might have a point that the 5128 is more anatomically correct on average, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's more anatomically correct for me. But maybe more to the point is, at this point, we're talking about the couplers. We're talking about IEC 711 couplers being worse than 5128 couplers. We're not talking about IEMs being worse than headphones. And then the second point that Andrew makes in trying to argue that IEM measurements are worse than headphone measurements is that insertion depth inside of the coupler. Here, let me demonstrate for you, right? Here is the common coupler. I can take this IEM, I can insert it here and measure it, get you a frequency response. But if I push it in further, I'll get a slightly different frequency response. And if I pull it out, you know, further out than it was before, from like right here, I'll get a slightly different frequency response. And that's actually 100% true. And that can actually have pretty significant impacts in terms of how an IEM sounds from person to person. Is how deep it goes into your ear will affect where the treble kind of bounces around inside your ear canal. And from one person to another, you might have completely different effects. In fact, let me show you real quick. These are my measurements of a Moondrop S8 that I tried at a couple of different insertion depths, right? So you can see the gray line, the dark blue line, and the light blue line. These are all the same IEM being measured at different insertion depths. And you can see how the treble frequencies that you get from that measurement really vary quite a bit. And one of these might actually align with your hearing better than another. But when you see these measurements put online, they're all usually aligning at 8,000 hertz. So they're kind of making an assumption that this is where, you know, it might land on your ear. But if it doesn't, you might not end up hearing what you see in a graph. And that is 100% accurate. I don't have any quibbles with Andrew's point there, but what I do have a quibble with is that is not even close to approximating the amount of variation that you get with headphone measurements, okay? So here I've also got measurements for an over-ear headphone. This is the Dan Clark Audio Stealth. And actually, hold on, let me turn off the S8 one so we're not looking at all those on top of it. But this is the way that Dan Clark Audio Stealth measures when I move the headphone around on my headphone rig to different positions. And you can see up here in the treble with the red lines and the yellow lines and the orange lines. Sorry for the bright lines, but you can see that there's a lot of variation in the treble just with positioning of the headphone. In fact, there's variation here in the upper mid-range with positioning on the rig, and there's even variation here in the lower mids and in the bass region, depending on the position of the headphone. So I don't know, I've taken a lot of measurements of headphones and taken a lot of measurements of IEMs. I personally have found that IEMs are a lot easier to get consistent results. Does that necessarily mean that it's more accurate or more predictive? I don't know that that's necessarily true, but I don't think that it's less accurate, again, given the consistency issues that you can see here just by changing one variable, which is position of the headphone on the head. And that doesn't even account for a couple of other variables that we don't even really measure for, which are head width, right? So like if you're wearing a headphone, the wider your head is, honestly, will start compressing the pads, and that will have an impact on the frequency response that you hear in your ear, as well as like, do you wear glasses like I'm wearing right now? Because if you wear glasses, right, this is what the Dan Clark Stealth measures like without glasses. If you put on glasses, this black line, well, that's what it measures like when you wear glasses. It significantly cuts the bass. Whereas if we go back to our Moondrop S8 measurements, and let's just limit this to one of them. All right, this is what the Moondrop S8 measures like without glasses. And you want to see what the Moondrop S8 measures like with glasses? I'm sorry. Oh, it still measures exactly like this with glasses, because glasses don't impact the sound that you hear with IEMs, obviously, because it has nothing to do with the seal in my ear. So again, like objectively, I think the IEMs produce more consistent results in couplers. Does that, again, mean that they're more predictive? In my experience, they are actually more predictive of what I hear versus headphone measurements, but that might just be to do with the fact that I'm more used to and familiar with looking at IEM measurements. I do it all the time. Headphone measurements, obviously, I do look at as well, but I would say I'm definitely not as comfortable or as familiar with headphone measurements as I am with IEMs. That said, just ultimately, I don't know. Do I think headphone measurements are better and IEMs are objectively worse? I kind of disagree. All right, let's move on to Andrew's second argument that IEMs are objectively worse than headphones, which is that IEMs are objectively worse because by design, they have to make more assumptions about the human anatomy than a headphone does. And there's some good points here. The basic gist of it, and you can watch his video to get the full gist, including some diagrams, but the basic gist of it is that your anatomy plays a part in sound, right? If I hear sound from a bird chirping in front of me, it hits my ears, it interacts with this part of my ear, it interacts with the inner part of my ear, and all of those things change the sound to the point that it gets to my ear canal and it sounds like a natural bird chirping. So now, assuming that you want a headphone to sound natural, you would, well, you'd more or less just play it the same, right? The headphone is going to sit on the outer part of your ear, so this part of your ear is going to still interact with that sound. Your ear canal is going to interact with the sound in the same ways it might normally. It'll reach your ear, it'll sound natural. That's, you know, everyone's ears and anatomy are different, but the bird is the same for everybody, and you kind of make sense of it all in your head. And a headphone kind of works the same way. It goes around the outside of your ear, and because of that, it doesn't have to assume what the outside of your ear is going to do to the sound, because your outside ear is still in play. When you use an IEM, however, well, this thing's going to bypass the outside of your ear. It's going to go into the ear canal directly, and that means that whatever the outside of my ear would be doing to the sound, the IEM has to kind of do that for you. It has to bake that into the recipe. But like we mentioned, everyone's got different shaped ears. So if an IEM has one ear shape baked into it, it might not work for somebody else that has a different shaped ear. Okay, that's just kind of the nature of IEMs. And that is a good point. However, I've got a couple of quibbles with that. So one, headphones are not beyond this problem. Headphones do still have to make assumptions about your anatomy. Like we kind of just talked about with the headphone measurements being a problem, those same variables come into play when it comes to people hearing the same thing through headphones, right? So headphone width. If my headphone or if my head is wider or narrower, that's going to have different effects on like how close my ear is to the driver. It's going to have effects on how much compression there is from the headband and the pads And all of those things are going to affect the sound coming out of that thing to the point that a headphone on my head could sound completely different from a headphone on your head. Or, like we mentioned too, if I'm breaking a seal, right? If I'm not getting a good seal on a headphone, either because I'm wearing glasses, maybe I've got facial hair, maybe I've just got a small head and the ear cups are too large, well then again, I'm going to be hearing something completely different from what another person is going to hear because that headphone was designed with a certain set of assumptions. And yes, IEMs are designed with an assumption of the outer ear shape. And that could be considered a problem, I suppose, but my honest read on that is that it just means that IEMs are more personal, right? You need to find the IEM that works well for your ear. And the good thing about the IEM space is that there's so many new IEMs coming out all the time that it's not really a problem. I mean, maybe it means that you can't rely on other people's opinions as much as you can with headphones, although again, with headphones, you got your own problems with that. But let's just take it at face value that the ear can, or the outer ear is the only problem. Maybe you can't take other people's opinions at face value as much as you can with headphones, but there's going to be plenty of options out there with IEMs. We measure them on squig.link, check them out. There's a lot of different IEMs out there. If you find one that has too much ear gain for you, there's other IEMs out there that have less and vice versa. So yeah, and then I guess you could also use EQ. That's another problem to the personalization problem. And is it even a problem, or is it just I don't want to say it's a benefit, but it's a solvable thing. So Andrew concludes his video by saying that there's no guarantee that what you see in a graph is going to translate to what you hear with the product, specifically talking about IEMs and how their measurements are worse than headphone measurements. And I'll be honest, I don't know that I totally agree with that just from my own personal experience. And again, maybe that experience is informed by the fact that I'm just a lot more accustomed to looking at IEM measurements, but I tend to find IEM measurements to be more consistent and more predictive of my own experience. That said, let's take it at face value. Maybe what that means is that IEM targets don't make as much sense, or at least a universal target doesn't make as much sense as a headphone target, like a Harman target or a diffuse field target. And I could be okay with that because while I would not agree that IEMs are objectively worse than headphones, I could agree that IEMs are objectively more personal than headphones. But I think there's a solution to that. And this is the part that might really upset Andrew, in that I think the solution is not a perfect Harman target or a perfect diffuse field target or even a perfect super review target. I think the solution is you have your own target. There's not just one target for IEMs. There's 7 billion targets out there. And I'm being a little facetious, but I'm also like kind of serious. You can use squiggling tools to generate your own target. Maybe I'll do a video one day on how to do that. And you can basically come up with a target that is your own preferences, your own ear assumptions, right? You know your anatomy better than anybody else. And having your own target and comparing IEMs against that, I think is the more personal solution to this more personal IEM problem. It's not really a problem. But yeah, I think that's going to do it for this video. If you found this helpful, you liked it, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and check out Andrew on the Headphone Show. He's linked down below. Otherwise, I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.